Hi everybody, it's Ajanette and I'm here to do your lecture on Chapter 11 on emotional behaviors. And so when we're talking about emotion, it's a really difficult concept in the field of psychology because it's still very much being researched and debated. And some people say that all animals have emotion and experience emotion, but that's not necessarily the case. What we observe in animals may not be a reflection of emotion so much as it is just instincts. And we need to keep in mind that emotions aren't inherently observable. And what we use is we really use the behaviors to kind of infer the emotions, and behaviors are most definitely observable. But when we're talking about emotion, we define it as something that's internal. It certainly affects how we're going to respond to our environment, and it includes both our cognitive thoughts and perceptions, our own kind of personal views, and how we respond or change to those perceptions. And then there's an autonomic and neural arousal that's involved in some emotional responses, which we'll look at in further detail later on in the semester. The most important thing when you're thinking about emotion is you recognize that there's a cognitive element or a mental or intellectual understanding of that emotion or situation. There's a feeling that we get in response to the situation, and then there's the behavior, how we respond to any given situation. So there's always those three components when we're talking about a discussion of emotion. So your book doesn't really talk about Darwin's theory of emotion, but I want to just include it in just so you have some background. So Darwin actually published The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, and he thinks that evolution is a critical component of emotions developing. And what he liked to do is compare behaviors across species in order to determine maybe the adaptive value of those emotions. And he had kind of three main ideas to his theory. Number one, that expressions of emotion evolve from behaviors that indicate what an animal is likely to do next. So one specific example is a threat display. So if you approach an animal or a dog, you can deduce that they're fearful or angry because they will actually arch their back, or they will actually display a posture that determines that they're either feeling threatened or threatening you. And then the second concept of if those signals for behaviors benefit the animal that is actually displaying those behaviors, then those behaviors are going to evolve in a way that will enhance that communication pattern. In other words, if displaying that threatening posture is going to maybe turn animals away, or there won't be as much conflict, it's going to contribute to their survival. And so therefore, from an evolutionary standpoint, those behaviors are going to continue to evolve in such a way as to allow that animal to communicate that sense of threat. And then in addition to the message itself, opposite messages are often signaled in opposite ways. So if I'm going to arch my back and I'm going to, stand firm and strong and tall when I feel threatened, and I'm threatening, and I'm displaying a position of aggression toward you, then if I'm feeling threatened or vulnerable or weak, then I'm going to maybe curve my back and I'm going to cow down, and I'm not going to have that strong posture, but more a posture of submission. So in our case, eye contact might be a posture of confidence, and looking away might be a posture that is associated with the opposite of not feeling confident. Okay, so when we talk about emotions, there is usually an autonomic response, and autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that is automatic. It's not something within our direct control, although we can influence it at times, and we'll talk about that later in the chapter. But it involves two separate nervous systems, our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. And so our sympathetic is usually going to stimulate or turn on various organs like our heart. It's going to cause it to beat a little faster, but it's also going to at the same time inhibit some organs that may not be necessary at the moment, such as maybe our digestive system. It's responsible largely for activating our fight or flight response, or our stress response. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is really what's managing digestion and those underlying automatic processes that will allow us to either use energy or save energy for a later date. So in many situations that activate emotions will either activate the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system in some way. Interestingly enough, when we talk about polygraphs, and again, this isn't in your book, it's just something I added for you, but polygraphs are, we think of them as lie detector tests, but we're really not deducing whether or not a person is lying. We're really reading the autonomic nervous system and those indicators for consistency across the tests. So it's really not detecting emotions or lies per se. It's really detecting that physiological response. So some people are able to control that physiological response even when they're lying, but in general, individuals have an autonomic response to that fear associated with lying. And so that comes through in the polygraph test. So just a couple of background theories that are really fundamental for how we study emotion in psychology is the James Lange theory of emotion. And what he basically talks about is he talks about how we have that autonomic response, and then we have a behavior that's triggered by that emotional feeling. And that response is really what produces the feeling of emotion. And so, in other words, for James Lange, I perceive a threat. I have a physiological response to that threat. My heart rate increases, my respiration rate increases. I can start to feel adrenaline run through my body. And based on that physiological response, I now have a sense of fear. And so the emotion follows that physiological response. Ken and Baird had an alternative viewpoint, and they suggested that one doesn't necessarily follow the other, so it's not sequential as you see in James Lange theory, but it's more simultaneous, where both the feeling of the fear and the physiological reactions are happening concurrently. And in modern views, although we'll go in and analyze James Lange further from your textbook standpoint, but in modern views of emotion, it kind of looks at these as kind of cyclical and how they all kind of feed one another, again, because we're including a cognitive element, an emotional or feeling, as well as that physical response or behavior. So with James Lange, the feeling or that emotion follows the behavior itself or that physical response. So you feel afraid because you run away, or you feel angry because you attack, not necessarily the other way, which is kind of common sense, where we feel like, well, I'm afraid, so then I run. No, he says, well, you run and then you feel the fear. So essentially you can conceptualize the emotion after the behavior occurs. If his theory is correct, then there's a couple of predictions that we could make in order to research and study the accuracy of his theory. Number one, people with weak autonomic responses don't have that same physiological response to circumstances, so therefore they should report feeling less emotion. And then the opposite should be true as well, where people that have maybe a heightened autonomic response should report having heightened emotional reactions as well. And in fact, when you look at some of the research, people that have spinal cord damage, they still report feeling the normal range of emotions under the same circumstances that people who are not paralyzed experience. Additionally, there's a condition called pure autonomic failure, where people have a complete loss of output from the autonomic nervous system. So it just doesn't even communicate with the body, and their bodies don't have any physiological response to stressful events at all. So they don't have that fight or flight reaction. They don't get that type of emotion like when they almost get in a car accident or something of that nature. And so their bodies are just kind of numb to those events, but yet they still report emotions. And also then another issue is, people who get Botox injections don't have the ability to respond to emotion or behave in a way that's consistent with, what an appropriate emotion is. And interestingly enough, they report less emotion. So in that sense, there's most of the research kind of is against the James Lange theory, but there is some research that supports it. Another incident where you would find support for James Lange is the concept of a panic attack. If you've ever had a panic attack, people often describe it like they're having a heart attack, or they feel like an elephant sitting on their chest, but they get an elevated heart rate. They have difficulty breathing. Their breathing becomes very shallow, and they often feel like they're suffocating. And then what happens is, based on how their body is physiologically responding in that panic attack, they start to feel fear. And there's tremendous anxiety that comes with that. In fact, if there's subsequent panic attacks, it can actually lead to panic disorder, where they start to become fearful of having a future panic attack. There's also a condition called Mobius syndrome, and this image is of a little girl who actually has experienced Mobius syndrome. And they can't move their muscles at all to smile, so they can't really express happiness because they don't have the smiling muscles, but yet they still report experiencing a sense of happiness. So again, they have the emotion independent or prior to having that physical response to the emotion. The opposite can be true too, where you can physically respond in a certain way and it will influence your emotion. And much of the research on facial feedback hypothesis supports that perspective. So with facial feedback, let me just move me out of the way. You actually are taught to put a pen in your mouth, and you should try this now. So if you just put a pen in your mouth, it kind of forces you to take on that smiling posture, right? And when they actually conducted a study and they had one group of participants holding a pen in their mouths, forcing them to smile, and that would correspond to a happy face, and then they had another group of participants that would not be forced to smile, and then they compared those two groups. They found that the individuals that had the facial expression were more likely, that who were forced to smile, they actually were more likely to report higher levels of happiness. So the process of smiling actually makes you report higher happiness levels, or makes you feel or experience greater happiness. And they actually taught me this in banking when I was taught phone skills, customer service skills. They taught me to smile when I answer the phone, because that smile comes through in the conversation. And if you smile, then you can embody that kind of emotion of happiness and contentment, and it will impact how you're actually feeling. So in this sense, your behavior, your posture, your facial expression drives your feelings instead of the other way around. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to stop this video. I'm going to go into another video, and I'm going to ask you to just watch the Amy Cuddy in between. So click on this link and watch the Amy Cuddy YouTube video. And then when we start the next video, we'll talk about that a little bit and then continue in our lecture.